Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to part 3 of our Geopolitics series. Today, as I mentioned in the last video, we're going to talk a little bit more about security and just-in-time manufacturing, why countries act and do the things that they do. And so let's sort of zoom out for a moment here and look at the world 70 years ago, give or take. And so roughly 70 years ago, World War II finished. Most of the, leading first world countries were more or less decimated. Their economies were decimated, the populations were decimated, and what the United States, who was basically the only man left standing in the arena at that point, decided to do was hoard everybody else's gold. And so we took in the rest of the world's gold, which historically was used to back this concept of fiat currencies. And we put that all into our Fort Knox, and we basically said we are going to become the world reserve currency, and we're going to do that in exchange for providing global security for everybody. Our fleets will patrol, our air force will be everywhere, and we're going to open up all borders everywhere. And this is known as Bretton Woods, and thus began the era of globalization. Now, what has happened since then, we've had this radical increase in the world's capacity to manufacture. And the reason for that is in large part due to this globalization effect. So if I could instead of making everything locally sourced in one place, I can now create a part over here and a part over there and a part over there, ship all three of those to a fourth location and build that somewhere else. And so roughly in the 1960s, we got I believe it's TSM, the standard shipping container size. And we saw a massive increase in our ability to ship goods at cheaper prices. And historically, which just by the way, a fun fact, the reason that America was so hyper successful over the last 250 years is because the US has more navigable waterways than every other place in the world combined. And what that means in a world where it costs 1/12 of the price to move things on water than it does on land, it was very easy and very profitable to expand in America. But sort of getting back to this larger view on things, what has happened since the 1960s is that we turn to more and more efficiency. And in the capitalistic corporate world, efficiency means profits. And so the way that we did that was by exporting everything. And so all of our labor got exported to cheaper third world countries, where we would have a single country or a single place build a specific item and then ship it somewhere else, where they would put it together somewhere else. This led to a concept called JIT, or just-in-time manufacturing. And what that means is that companies wouldn't even keep stock of anything. And because the global alliance that America had used to bribe up against the Soviet Union was so successful, we stopped having to even worry about keeping things in warehouses. And this was all fine and dandy up until about end of 2019, 2020, when COVID came around. And so what COVID did was it created a massive shockwave and stressor across global supply chains. And very quickly we realized how vulnerable this entire new world and economy became. Only now are we really feeling these ripple effects, and they're going to continue, and they're only just starting. So if you think about using an analogy of an earthquake, COVID was this sort of earthquake deep out in the ocean, and we're watching this massive tidal wave rush into shore now. And so we got a series of smaller waves, and unfortunately, combined with several other geopolitical factors, it appears that food is going to be the next thing on this list that's really going to get shaken up going into the beginning of next year. And this is due to several reasons. Firstly, the world consumes about 25% of their daily calories is grain. And with Russia and Ukraine being the first and fourth largest producers of that, and due to their war, we are looking at something in the range of, I believe, 30% of global wheat to not be shipped out this year. And I know that very recently they have started to ship out some wheat from Ukraine. I don't know if they're going to be able to get all of that out or in time. Additionally, the world's largest fertilizer producer, once again Russia, dealing with things like macronutrients like nitrogen, whether that's in the form of urea or otherwise. or things that are like phosphorus or potash. These are, the three macronutrients that are super, super important when dealing with anything, with regards to yields and food. And so, like I said in the last video, we added 8 billion people to the world. We added 6.5 billion people to the world in the last century. And since the end of World War II, like since the late 1800s, but really since the end of World War II, we've seen this massive increase, the green revolution, if you would, in terms of using these artificial fertilizers. And so that has boosted yields by some 15-20%, and we've become overly reliant on them. And just as we've become overly reliant on just-in-time manufacturing. And what's happening from this process now is that as a result of not having enough fertilizers, we're going to see reduced yields. As a result of geopolitical tensions in various places in the world, we're going to see reduced yields. As a result of supply chain breaks in the supply chain, we're going to see reduced food moving around. And so even if a place like the US has a surplus, if we don't have a way to get that to a third world country, people are going to starve. And this is something that actually, by the way, I believe it was the WEF had this up before they took it down very quickly. They had a professor out of Hawaii, I believe, that wrote an article about why starvation is actually good, why like caloric deprivation is actually helpful to society and increases productivity. And that's actually a really sick narrative, because we do live in a world where we have a surplus of food. I mean, look at America. It's like America, I mean, you can make the claim that America is actually starving, even though the majority of the population is obese. Over 50% of our children now are obese as well. And we actually have more people dying from obesity, on an order of magnitude more people dying from obesity than starvation in the United States. We could make the claim that they're actually being fed empty calories, if you would. And so the biggest lie that was ever taught to us by Coca-Cola and some of these large conglomerates is that a calorie equals a calorie. And the reality is that that's not actually true, because it's the quality of that calorie that matters. It's the size of that calorie that matters. And so when I have a soda that's only 150 calories, but is filled with 60 grams of sugar or high fructose corn syrup, which is like the difference between like a beer and a shot of, vodka, if you would. And we're just consuming these empty calories all day. I could get to a point where I'm eating a Happy Meal, a fast meal, that's coming out to 5,000 plus calories, between a milkshake and a burger and several other products. I mean, it's disgusting to the extent that we could calorically gouge ourselves on these empty foods. The problem is that they're very often missing their micronutrients. They have crazy imbalances in their sodium potassium ratios. They're filled with either salt, sugar, or fat, which is, in nature as a whole, those are generally the three more scarce items. And as a result of that, our brains really light up when we eat that. That's why we love, something like honey or like a salt marsh or, animal fat. Those aren't as common, say, as, some grass, or, really anything else. I guess the point that I'm trying to make with all of this is that as we're getting into a world with larger security issues, we have to really ask ourselves, where does security fit in with all of this? And so a country like America, for example, and the reason, another reason why America was able to really expand so rapidly is because we're actually pretty isolated. We're an island for all, we're a continent, but we're an island for all intents and purposes. We're not anywhere near Europe. We're not anywhere near Asia. We directly control Mexico and Canada, and those are our staunchest allies. And as a result of that, we don't, as well as, including the Monroe Doctrine, we've actually isolated a majority of the Western Hemisphere. And so as an independent country, the U.S. doesn't actually care as much what happens in the rest of the world per se. The whole reason that we used globalization was to fight the Soviets, and since 91, we've sort of been just running in circles with no real common purpose, running a massive bill. The U.S. spends 50% of its GDP on military spending, which is actually how we beat the USSR, by the way. We just went into an arms race with them, and once the USSR went over 50%, they basically fell apart. And one could make the claim now that the U.S. is getting pretty close to that too. I mean, you couple that with, sort of historical figure data that empires, historically last about 250 years, and, we're coming up on that pretty close. At the next election cycle, we're going to be around 250. The point being that as that security looks very different for everybody, right? This is why Russia went to war, because they have a flat plane from a geography perspective. A country like Germany, which has no ability to independently secure energy, is now facing, on the one hand, it wants to stand with its Western allies. On the other hand, it has to capitulate to Russia to be able to receive energy. We're going to see what happens there this year. They're expecting, energy increases of 10x and more, where people are going to be spending, I saw in the range of already, they said to prepare for 1,500 to 2,000 euro a month electricity bills. That's not sustainable. That's not even livable for most people. And, again, like I said, the two driving factors that, politicians fear more than anything else is food insecurity and energy insecurity, because those are the two things that actually cripple an industry faster than anything else. And they don't have a way of just procuring more of it. Although with energy, you can make the claim that we should actually go nuclear. And that's its own rabbit hole about why people aren't interested in going down there. And I would say that has to do more with sort of, and I don't want to go down really any rabbit holes or mention things. So I'm not really going to get into that right now. But there are a lot of vested interests why not to go nuclear, although it would seem like the easiest and most rational way of becoming energy secure and energy independent. The U.S. was under Trump. We lost that with Biden. And we have managed now, just before primaries, to quote unquote stabilize our gas pricing by depleting a majority of our strategic reserves. And this actually isn't good at all. It's great that gas is under $4 a gallon now, but like at what cost? And that's something that's going to take a long time to fill back up. And I don't think people are aware of the potential consequences of not having that ability on hand. To me, it seems like if you look sort of, we're going to go off on a little tangent here for a second, but one of the primary things in Chinese philosophy is this concept of fighting a war, where you fight a war not head to head with your enemy, but you win a war by getting your enemy to the point where they're not even willing to engage in a war with you. And that is exactly what we're seeing China do today. China has been waging this sort of unconventional warfare on us for the better part of 3 decades. Primarily in our economics, as well as in espionage, and they've stolen billions and billions of, in IP. And, think about something like this, right? Like it takes, let's say, $1 billion to research something, and then it takes, you get your product to market, and then China sends in an espionage team, and it costs them maybe $1 million to deploy, and bam. Instead of having to spend $1 billion on their own research, they're now able to steal that for $1 million and build it out for themselves and build out a copy. And we know this. China is the greatest copycat when it comes to that kind of thing. Every country has its own security issues. And that has to do with the fact that their populations look different and their geographies look different. At the end of the day, we're all fighting over the same resources. And so this is sort of going to lead into and you'll hear about this more and more in the future, this need for a global narrative. And by global narrative, I don't mean a global narrative led by a select few, which is generally the way that the word globalist gets used. Rather, I mean a global narrative where we share a common story. And so what I mean by that, and we'll sort of jump into this for a second, is the biological human only has the physical capacity for 150 interpersonal connections. And what that effectively means is that between family, friends, coworkers, colleagues, and everything and anything in between, we could only track 150 stories at the same time. And the way that we sort of get around this limitation is through a story. And what I mean by that is, if you were to take, for example, let's say 20,000 monkeys and put them into a stadium, they would very quickly rip each other to pieces because they wouldn't be able to distinguish friend from foe. And the way that humans get around that is by telling stories. We tell this sort of, meta layer on top of being human. I say, oh, I'm an American, I'm a Yankees fan, I'm a New Yorker, right? We have all these different stories that we tell one another in order to be able to associate without having to know one another. So now I could go sit in Yankee Stadium with 50,000 people, and I don't have to worry about the guy next to me, because even if he's a Mets fan, because we're baseball fans, or because we're Americans, or because we're Yankees fans. And when I say that we need a globalized story, what I mean is that we need to create a narrative amongst everybody, a movement, if you would, that comes from the bottom up, a grassroots movement, not a top-down elitist approach, where we actually all want something. And the reality is we do, right? And this is something that politicians won't normally talk about because it's so basic and intuitive that they don't want to be seen as dumb, right? Like, sure, I want to have a better future for my kids. Sure, I want to have more peace and stability, etc. Like all those sort of core values that most, almost the vast majority of populations want, to come together and be able to build something like that. And part of what that means is reprioritizing the human or homo sapiens relationship to the rest of the world. And so the largest problem, in my opinion, of what we've seen going on over the last several hundred years is that we took this concept of liberalism, or the real version, right, where you have like the original version where it's all about the individual. And as a result of focusing or hyper-focusing on the individual, that led to, even our systems that we build still tend to reflect the individual, right? And if that's through capitalism, if that's through even something like communism, like there is still an emphasis on the individual. Granted, in communism, it kind of broke because there was no individual incentive to work for things like that. It's also its own separate thing, its own rabbit hole to get into. But the point being, without having a narrative by which we can all commonly pull on, we're screwed. And we're screwed very simply because the problems that we're facing today don't stop at the edge of my border, right? A problem like climate change is a global problem. It's a regional problem. And so it doesn't matter what my country or my city does. If we don't all do something together, it doesn't matter, because someone else, somewhere else is going to be screwing that up. And this is also the really cool thing about networks. And we're going to touch on this a lot more in some of the coming videos, and this concept of a network versus something, let's say the concept of a state. A network, and what Web3, or not even Web3, what the internet as a whole gave us was the ability to create these rooms, these forums, these Reddit threads, and all these different amalgamations of information and communities, where what we do is we effectively decide on rules. We decide on what we want to agree on. Okay, in this group we're only talking about trees, or whatever it is. And in order to join that group, you got to accept those rules. You got to accept the Reddit's rules. You got to accept whatever platform you're using. There's been a large disconnect between the amount of time that we spend in these places and what we do, with actual putting that into practical implementation in the real world. And this is the really cool merging effect that we're seeing now between Web3, crypto, tokenization, and the older internet, and these communities and social graphs that have been built starting to merge together. Because what's happened now is that through something like tokenization, or the ability to effectively create a token out of thin air and then ascribe to that some sort of value amongst a people that a group of people that commonly hold on to the same set of ideas. Which, by the way, that's what money is, right? Like, money is not even backed by anything anymore. That's a concept of fiat, right? In God we trust, in the Federal Reserve we trust. We don't actually have something sitting. You can't redeem your dollar for gold anymore. And this is the same thing. We create a token around a community of people that share community and belief. And in the process of doing so, we are now able to really, step forward and talk about and discuss the things that we want to discuss create that value in the real world, and then use that value to buy real world assets to then go, as far as something like the UN and demand, hey, we want to be recognized as a country. I believe there's like some 25-30% of countries that have like literally less than 1 million people in them, right? You're talking these tiny islands. Luxembourg, right? Powerhouse, only has 500,000 people in it. Monaco, right? I mean, like these places are tiny. Take, for example, on the flip side, someone like Kim Kardashian, right? Which is, granted, it's the very opposite extreme of that, but she has 75 million followers, right? I think it was a make her like top 10 largest countries in the world just by follower, right? Now, granted, like, bubble butt's nice and all, but that's not exactly a global agenda, although some would make the argument that it is. And what in all seriousness, though, it's this ability to create a narrative, to follow through with that narrative in the real world that's going to radically change the way that the world looks. Because take, for example, something like climate change, right? A lot of people care about it in a lot of places in the world. But you can't actually do anything because maybe my individual country's stuck on whatever particular thing that it's stuck on. Maybe my region's not getting along. But if I could create a community now and all of a sudden gain a following of 100 million people, 1 billion people, which isn't that crazy if you start looking out 10, 20 years down the road, I think very much we'll have that traction. If we get them all aboard, then it doesn't really matter what the state wants to do, because at the end of the day, the state is only made up of individuals. And if the individual chooses, instead of to look up to the state as this end-all be-all, but rather to the network, which is the layer above that, we're not bound by geography anymore. We're not even bound by demography. And it's super cool to watch this, because our biggest challenges that we face in today's world are going to seem obsolete in the next generation. And that's because this framework that we live in is changing right now. And this is where this fight is going head to head right now. This is where the state, and we're going to talk a lot more about this. I borrowed several of these ideas from a book called The Network State. Amazing read. I highly recommend it to all of you. We are going to be watching now this battleground between the state and the network really start to play out. This is going to have a lot of, secondary, and tertiary effects. And at the end of the day, we want to really be positioned properly for that. I mean, we want to, in order to, effectuate the changes that we want to see in the world, right? As the plane's going down, you got to put on your own oxygen mask first before you help the person next to you. And not that I think that this plane is going down per se, but, it's sort of like, sitting on a precipice, on the edge of a ledge, right? And you sit there for a long time, and you know that you just need to jump, right? You just got this new jetpack on, you got to try it out. You know that it works. You've spent, all your money and time and effort investing in it. But until you take that first little jump, right? You don't know where you're going to go. And so that's sort of how I see this transformation into the new world, where we just need this little push off the hill. And I believe that's what COVID was. Not getting into who started it, not getting into why, and that's its own rabbit hole as well. But that was the spark that has set into motion this new wave of growth. And in order to do that, kind of like a lobster, right? We have to be able to shed this old shell and grow into a new one. And so I think that we're in the process of shedding that now. And in the interim, until we grow this new shell, we need to find this sort of stable rock to hide away under, to be able to make sure that we don't get hurt in this, transformative process. And that's really what this channel is about, is, giving, you guys a little bit of sort of my perspective on that, the perspective of someone that has, some survival skills, that has some knowledge, and, really being able to work through this with everybody and see where this goes. So I hope you enjoyed. And we're going to continue on with part 4 very shortly. Have a great day.